Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We talked about squirrels last time, terrestrial topic. This week, Joe, you want to talk about fish again. So what particular fish are you interested in?
Yeah, we're going to talk about Percids today. I think it's important that we take a second for those people that are not being able to view us on YouTube right now to point out my beautiful attire. So We're recording this on the opening day of Cincinnati Reds baseball. As an Ohio boy, huge Reds fan, so I'm decked out in my Reds gear from head to toe. You know, my wife always builds me up before I record and tells me I really have a nice face for radio. And so, you know, I'm glad that people can hear me. But I wish that everyone out there listening to us could also see the beauty that I'm exerting today. So,
well, we'll forgive you for wearing red in this nice recording studio with purple trim.
Yeah, well, I love the purple, but hey, I got to be a Reds fan today. But what a great day! We're going to see some Reds baseball as they begin their journey towards the World Series. But we're going to start out by talking about Percids today. So Percids are a big family of fish. They're second only to minnows, which are known as cyprinids. And so a really diverse group of fish that are found in Kansas, and anglers a lot of times are out fishing for some of those, but we're going to chat about the Percids today. A good topic for us to jump into here in early spring.
Good. I'm excited about that. I guess before we go further in, you know, biologists sometimes have different terms that they use to talk about different things. So you said Percids and cyprinids. So if we're thinking about, you know, how that fits into why we're calling these fish those names, what is that? What's that represent?
So their family name is Percidae and Cyprinidae, right? And so we just shorten those down. It's talking about a family, which is kind of a large group that has a bunch of similarities. From there, we'd break it down into genus and species, and that kind of would tell you, you know, just a little bit more specifically what type of fish we're looking at. So we're talking about families, the family of Percidae today, the Percid group. So they're going to have a lot of similarities, some differences that we're going to chat through.
Good. So what are some common Percids that people might know of?
Sure. The ones that most of our listeners are probably familiar with are going to be Walleye, Yellow Perch, Saugeye, Sauger. So those are the ones that are kind of at the top of the list. Most people are going to have eaten a walleye sandwich or been out fishing for them. They're going to understand those a lot. A lot of the diversity in this family, though, is in little fish called darters. And these darters really like flowing water. They're found in little streams. They're found in rivers. Sometimes you can find them in ponds or reservoirs, but that's not really their forte. They really like that flowing water, really small fish. And you know, there are some really, really pretty darters out there. I've had a native fish tank in a lab in the past, and people have walked in and said, "Oh, where are these fish from?" And when you show them a rainbow darter, an orange throat darter with the coloration, you know, they're surprised to hear that they're in Kansas. So fun to see those pretty fish.
It's definitely amazing how much diversity there is in color and just how cool some of our native fish can be. And when we pull them out of maybe they might be in some murky water and their colors are a little bit muted. You throw them in that clear water in the tank and maybe make sure it's cold and those colors really pop.
Yeah, those males are making those bright colors. It's kind of as a way to attract a mate, right? And so the really pretty ones are almost always males. The females generally are kind of more of a brown or a green color maybe. That's kind of ubiquitous across species, but some of those other darters have really, really bright, pretty colors.
Yeah, very cool. So if we're thinking about the species that people are going to see most often, walleye, sauger, and saugeye, how would we identify those different species?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, and so you can start out. I'll kind of go through each of those individually and point out some of the things we're going to look at. We're going to look at their cheeks. So whether they have scales on their cheeks is kind of one of the first things. their dorsal fins, kind of the coloration we have there, the side of their bodies, the coloration on the side of their bodies. And then we're going to talk a little bit about their caudal fin or their tail. And so start out with walleye. Walleye, they kind of have a most of them on the bottom of their caudal fin have a white tip on it. So that'd be indicative of a walleye just to start. Their cheeks are smooth. So you might find, 4 or 5 scales on some walleye, but most of the time their operculum, that hard flap that covers the gills, doesn't have scales on it. Their sides are kind of just a consistent greenish color along the entire side. You don't see dark spots or dark blotches is what we would say. And then their dorsal fin, if you lift up their dorsal fin, the front part of their dorsal fin, if you put your hand on it, would be really pokey. And that's called the spinous dorsus, or the spiny dorsal fin. And if you look at that, it's going to kind of have either really pale streaks or no streaks at all. It's not going to be very obvious that it has spotting like a Dalmatian dog or something like that. So it's going to be kind of, consistently they have a little bit less coloration to them. So those are walleye. Those fish are found. They're native up to northern parts of Canada. All the way down. Their native range extends about halfway down in the northern part of Kansas. So historically, there were some native walleye in our area. Now we've introduced them, from East Coast to West Coast, North to South America. So they're spread out quite a bit, but that's kind of, where we would have found them. Generally, they like colder water. So find them in areas with a little bit colder water. So those are the walleye.
So thinking about native Kansas walleye before we started moving around and all that kind of stuff, I mean, would we have found them in the Kansas River, Smoky Hill River, those kind of bodies of water? Yeah,
they would have been found in something like that, and they would have generally been a little bit on the smaller side probably, but we would have seen them in some of those flowing water systems in the northern part of the state.
Sure. Okay, cool. So what about Sauger?
Yeah, Sauger are another native species. Their native range overlaps a lot with walleye. They tend to be a little bit more east and a little bit more south from their extent, and they don't go quite as north up into Canada. And they tend to be a little bit smaller bodied fish. But if you were to hold them up side by side, most people, if you looked at them, would think they're the same species. But some of the differences we can look at, that the bottom of their tail usually doesn't have that white spot on it, really obvious. Their cheeks are going to be rough. If you rub their hand over their cheeks, you're going to feel some rough scales on there. It might not be completely covered, but you're going to feel a little bit of a rough patch. One of the things you're going to see relatively quickly is dark blotches on the side of their body. That's going to be kind of indicative that you have a sauger. And then their spiny dorsal fin is going to have circles kind of, patterned on there in a relatively consistent manner. So some of the, it's going to look very similar, but there are some differences there if you were to hold them up and look at them.
Maybe more camouflage looking for the sauger than the walleye.
Yeah, it would definitely be what we would consider kind of a camouflage, kind of that the blotchy different colors on there. Yeah, but they're both going to kind of blend in that deeper habitat, just a little bit different way to do it.
Yeah, cool. And then when we're moving these fish around and stocking bodies of water, do we always put in either sauger or walleye, or do we like to have hybrids of them?
Back early, before the 1970s or so, we would stock mostly walleye is what we were stocking. There would have been some sauger that were stocked, but it was mostly walleye. What we see with walleye is that their recruitment, once you release a bunch of fry or fingerlings, they didn't have a very high survival rate, and so they weren't recruiting well. Recruiting means kind of joining the population at different size classes, right? And so they weren't growing up to a size where they could be fished very easily. And so we started looking for some different ways to do that, and we started crossing Sauger and Saugeye. And so what we do now most of the time is we take walleye eggs and we take Sauger milt, which is sperm, and we kind of combine all of that. They actually take a feather a lot of times and really gingerly stir this all together and fertilize the eggs, and then that cross between the walleye female and the Sauger males makes what we would call a Saugeye. Most of the time, that's what we're stocking these days, primarily in most of the reservoirs around Kansas and around North America.
So how would you tell the difference between a Saugeye and a Sauger, or a Saugeye and a walleye?
Yeah, so a Saugeye is going to look a lot like a Sauger. You're going to see those dark blotches on the side. Some of the differences, the first thing I would look at are the cheeks. And the cheeks on a Saugeye have scales along the entirety of them. And so they're rough, they're scaly all the way along the side. Usually don't have that white spot at the base of their tail. The spotting on their spinous dorsal fin, it's going to be there, but it's not going to be really uniform, right? And so if we kind of think about a Dalmatian dog, right? With a Sauger, it would kind of look like that, where we expect that spotting to be kind of consistent around the body. With a Saugeye, it would look like someone came along and erased half the spots. So there's still evidence of them there, but they're not as uniform and consistent across that body. The easiest way for most people that don't do this every day would be to look at the cheeks and see if it has scales all the way along those cheeks, and the white spot and the blotchiness. So we try to stay away from coloration most of the time with fish, because it's going to change, right? It changes on the daily basis depending on whether it's sunny or cloudy. Is the water murky or not? The fish have melanophores that they can make bigger or smaller, and that can change what they look like. So that's why I keep kind of coming back to some of the pigmentation, and the fins doesn't necessarily go away, and those scales on the cheeks are definitely going to stay consistent. So try to steer away from coloration as much as we can, but intuitively, that's a lot of times what we jump to.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, what do walleye, Saugeye, and Sauger eat?
Yeah, they're going to eat a lot of the same things, right? And so they like to eat little fish. That's going to be a big part of what they eat, or I guess if it's a big walleye, bigger fish. And so a lot of their diet are fish that we don't necessarily want in high amounts in reservoirs or other areas that we'd be stocking them. So things like gizzard shad. We've talked about gizzard shad are generally small, but they can grow up and get bigger to a size where nothing can eat them. And that can become a concern because they eat a lot of plankton, which can compete with some of the other fish we want. So they're going to be eating a lot of those. They eat a lot of freshwater drum. Drum make a lot of babies, and so they're kind of just an easy source for food for walleye or sauger to go after. They'll eat small walleye sometimes, white crappie or another fish. All these species that I'm mentioning are fish that can easily get out of control if there's not a predator in the system. So they have a really important function, even if they're eating crappie, which a lot of people want to go catch. If we don't have something eating those crappie, we're quickly going to end up with too many crappie, and then you're going to crash your fishery. So I think sometimes people get caught off guard when we say that they are eating crappie or something like that, but it's part of a balanced system, right? So eating a lot of small fish, invertebrates. So I'm sure, if you've gone fishing for them before, this is a great time of year to use a night crawler. So they love to eat night crawlers. Up north, leeches, I remember going out and my dad telling me when I was little, you just walk out and stand there for a little while, and then you'll walk out of the pond or creek in Minnesota and you have leeches on you. And I still remember being horrified and thinking he was crazy for doing that. But most of the time now we go buy them. We've gotten to a different point in life, but getting those leeches, they make great bait, right? And so, and depending on the time of year, whether the leeches are out or the worms are out, they'll eat crayfish, they'll eat bugs that fall in. So, they're kind of eating a lot of different things out there.
It seems like leeches are a much more common bait that folks use up north than around Kansas and further south. I know growing up, we'd go up to northern Minnesota and fish for pike and crappie and walleye and stuff. And every bait shop you went into had a tank full of leeches, and folks used them for walleye, but also crappie. And you don't see that down here. Is that because there's fewer leeches in our water as we go farther south?
Yeah. as leeches tend to like colder water, spring-fed water they really like. And so, when we get down into warmer temperatures, I'm not saying we don't have them down here, but we have them in much lower densities in general. There's the lake that I was talking about was called Leech Lake, right? And it was aptly named. You would walk out there, and I'm not exaggerating when I'd say you'd have leeches on your legs when you climbed out of it. I don't think it's, the numbers aren't necessarily that high anymore, but they tend to be a little bit northern species and something that we'll see around Kansas. They tend to be smaller here too. They'd be hard to put on a hook. So just some of the considerations.
I know my family is very averse to stuff like that, and it seems like every time we go somewhere, somebody will get a leech on them, or we'll find a snake somewhere where I wasn't expecting to see a snake. And first time I took my wife Tara and our kids swimming or boating, whatever we were doing in the Kansas River, we were leaving, and I looked down and saw a leech on my son's leg, and I just reached over and snagged it and threw it out the truck window before they could see it.
Yeah, well, hopefully they don't listen to this episode if they don't know that story.
They know it happened.
Yeah, leeches are one of those things that they really aren't going to hurt you. I mean, they're icky maybe a little bit. We're just not familiar with them, right? It's not something I'd be excited about having on me, but for the most part, they're not going to really do any harm if they're on you for a short period of time, especially.
Yeah. So, do the young fry or the young of the year Percids, are they eating the same thing that the adults are?
Yeah, that's a good point. And so, one of the really important things with these fish is that they're reproducing early. And one of the things that the young a year, the really, really small, 1/4-inch fish, right? One of the things that they need are zooplankton in the water. And so in order to have zooplankton, a lot of times you need to have phytoplankton. So making sure that you have a good balance of plankton in your system that these really small fish can eat is going to be important. And that's important, as we get a little bit more north, we tend to have a little bit more oligotrophic lakes, so lakes with lower nutrient loading. And that can become an issue with, do we have enough food in there for these young of the year to grow up in? If we're growing them in captivity, that's something we need to kind of keep track of, right? Do we have enough food for these really small fish to eat? And sometimes, we've shown, there's been a lot of work in Iowa that shows that if you can feed them zooplankton, they're going to grow a lot better than if you feed them an artificial feed. So a lot of work done there. That's really important that they have enough of that food when they're really, really small in order to be able to get them to grow up.
Yeah, I remember when I was when I was an undergraduate student here at K-State, there was a grad student that was studying walleye fry predation on zooplankton called diatoms. Yeah. And if I remember right, he was trying to see if there was a trophic cascade where, like, in areas where there were more walleye fry, were there fewer diatoms, and did that let there be more phytoplankton in that spot or something like that?
Yeah, that could be. I don't know specifically about that research, but diatoms, they have a really unique shape a lot of time. They almost look like jewelry or something when you look at them underneath a microscope. So you could see, some sort of cascading effects there. I know that there are trophic cascades with larger fish, right? If you take large predatory walleye or other similar Percids out of a system, crappie can grow up or gizzard shad can grow up, and then that can cause decreases in the plankton abundance. And you can see, long term, over a period of 5 or 10 years, the entire fishery can start to collapse. So, things that we don't necessarily think about, thinking about a little young of the year fish eating, what does it have to eat? And how does that affect things? Most of us aren't thinking that a larval fish or a group of larval fish can cause a problem, but each of these walleye or sauger, each of these Percids can lay up to 100,000 eggs.
Wow.
So that is a lot of little tiny mouths going around eating little plankton, right? Yeah. So it can quickly add up.
Crazy. Do the adults have any, like, temporal variation in their feeding? Do they have some behavior about their predation that's interesting?
Yeah. So they this time of year, we're in late or early spring, I guess, right? And so we're starting to see them feed in preparation for spawning. You can start to see them move up to some of the dams that we have at the reservoirs, or they migrate upstream for their reproduction. And so this time of year, they're really eager to get out there and be eating, right? So that they can have a lot of energy for reproduction. So pretty easy to catch them. And the water's cool right now. The sun's not beating down, so you can see them in a little bit more shallow habitat. They tend to want to eat at night. And so they got their name walleye because they have really big eyes and they can see in dark areas. So they like to be deeper. They're really sensitive to light. And so this time of year, you might be able to catch them during the day. If you're out in the summertime, you'd want to be fishing for them, when it's not very bright. Catching a walleye in the middle of the day, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it'd be a lot easier to catch them at dawn or dusk or overnight than it would be during the day.
Sure. One of the things about that's cool to me is, a lot of our mammals that are active at night and do a lot of hunting at night have these reflective surfaces inside their eyes, and so you see their eyes shine in your headlights like a cat or a coyote or a dog or whatever. I've been out gigging frogs before and shine my light out into the water and seen eyes reflecting back at me, and that was a walleye or saugeye or whatever was in that body of water.
Yeah, that can be really frustrating if you're out there fishing too, right? When they're actively spawning, they're not going to be eating, and so you can throw a lure or a worm or something right in front of them, and you can see a trophy fish, and it just absolutely ignores you. So it's a double-edged sword. It's fun to see them, but man, if you're out there fishing, it can be quite frustrating as well.
Yeah. So, you talked a little bit about the history of stalking these fish when I asked you about saugeye. Are these a fish that we're going to put into a farm pond, or are they mainly fish we put in reservoirs or rivers, or how's that work?
Sure. Normally we're not going to want to stock walleye. Now I say normally because if you love walleye enough, it's possible to put them in a larger pond, but it's going to take a lot of management in order to keep them there and get them to a point that you're happy with it. You got to remember that they're a predatory fish, and so they're going to cruise around and they're going to eat a lot of other fish. You have to make sure that they have enough food there to grow up. They don't like warm water. And in Kansas, even a 10, 12, 14 foot deep pond, that water heats up enough, right? Yeah. And if it doesn't, a lot of times that's because it's stratified. And if you have stratification, the hypolimny on the deeper water is cool, but it doesn't have any oxygen. Right?
Sure.
And so the fish can't go down there if they can't breathe. And so then they're trapped in the upper layer where it gets warmer. Walleye especially are really susceptible to warmer temperatures. And so it's going to be hard to get them established in a pond, a smaller pond. Not necessarily something you can't do, but it's going to take a lot of management in order to get it to be successful. It would be very rare that I would recommend them as a fish to stock in a pond.
What about structure in that pond? Would their habitat requirements be different than the other critters?
Well, they really like rocky substrate, right? And so you'd have to make sure that you have some big boulders of some sort build up if you want to see successful reproduction. The other thing that happens in ponds is a lot of times they're smaller, and so predation risks for the eggs can tend to be higher. Getting that recruitment success, making sure you have enough plankton in a smaller area, it's just very hard, sure. Right? And so I know of a couple people that have done it, but they have endless pockets and they have a lot of time on their hands. And so it's something they really want to do. And if you really, really want to do it, you can. But for most of us, it's just not going to be practical.
So what about stocking in reservoirs and stuff like that? What's important to know there?
Yeah, so I mentioned we started doing that in the 60s and 70s, and what we saw was that they recruit a lot better. There's the survival. Let me back up. We started stocking Saugeye in the 60s and 70s. Before that, we were stocking walleye, and we saw their populations. The walleye just weren't recruiting very well. We'd add them into reservoirs in really large numbers, and we weren't getting harvestable classes down the way. And so we switched over to Saugeye. One of the other benefits of Saugeye is they tend to be a little bit more aggressive feeder. I don't know if you fish much for walleye, but if you fish for walleye, I mean, you almost need to baby that lure into their mouth, right? There's something called a Lindy rig that they use a lot up north with, and it has the weight kind of separate from the line. So when you feel a bite, you can let go of your line. Otherwise, that fish tends to spit out that lure or the worm or whatever you have trailing there. So Saugeye are a little bit more aggressive in how they hit. They fight a little bit better. So we started stocking those. There's a researcher named Alan Johnson in Iowa, and he's done a lot of work looking at, when do we stock these fish? And so historically we thought, we can stock them as fry, which are really small fish. We can get a bunch of them, we'll release them, and some of those will reproduce. It's cheaper that way because you don't have to feed the fish for a long time. But what we found is that generally it's better to stock a much lower number of fingerlings, fish that are 3 or 4 inches long, that we've spent time growing up, we've spent money getting them to a bigger size class. So they have a lot better success. And so what we've kind of shifted to, still stock a lot of fry, but we've shifted a little bit towards stocking some more of those fingerlings. So understanding the implications of where you're putting them is important. You wouldn't want to necessarily just go catch them, throw them in your farm pond by any means.
Yeah. One of the things that I guess I have weird experiences. One of the things that you mentioned was that walleye are much more delicate feeders, and I haven't done much like intentional walleye fishing. Yeah, but the few walleye I've caught while I was trolling for pike. Yeah, and they must have been really hungry.
Well, that's so I mentioned that. Now, if you're trolling, if you're actively moving a crankbait and they hit that, that's more of a reactionary strike a lot of times. And so walleye have a really good sense of smell. If you're fishing for them slowly with a worm, a lot of times if we were to have a camera down there, the worm would kind of go by and they would kind of swim after it for a little bit and then decide eventually they want to eat it, right? That situation is where you would need to be delicate with the line. The reactionary strike, which would be trolling a crankbait by their face, that's kind of, you send a delicious meal 2 inches from their eyes and they just decide they can't resist it anymore and they smack it. So I'm not saying that you always have to be careful with it. What you just mentioned certainly happens, right? But not as often as the kind of delicate, purposeful feeding that they would do. Walleye also tend to they don't get in big schools. I mean, they're not like swarming around, but they tend to aggregate kind of in a little area. So if you go out fishing for them and you find a walleye, a lot of times it's a good idea to mark that on your map if you have one, and then kind of circle that area. A lot of times they'll be coming back to kind of that same region.
Well, that makes sense. What about reproduction?
Yeah, so reproduction, these fish are reproducing somewhere between March and May, and a little bit earlier, the farther south you go, our water temperatures warm up a little bit sooner. So we're seeing reproduction, in Kansas, maybe starting late March and then continuing through the middle of April. Maybe there's a couple fish still spawning at the end of April, but that's kind of our hot spot. If you were to go up to northern Minnesota or North Dakota, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, we're probably pushing that back towards May. And so they're reproducing kind of that spring time frame. They really like gravel or big rocky structures. So you'll see them. We've talked about them stacking up on dams, and a lot of times that's because those dams are lined with really big boulders. That's the type of habitat they like, right? And so tend to stock up in these big bunches. The other thing they historically did, they can migrate really long distances upstream. And I remember being fascinated when I learned about fish migration, that they could swim hundreds of miles upstream, right? And so walleye used to migrate upstream, 100 plus miles. And that's important for if we're talking about fishing, because that means they might stack up underneath dams, sure, right? And the tailwaters might be a good opportunity for you to go out and harvest some of them that you see in those areas.
Very right? Cool.
They have kind of a cool reproductive strategy where they get a lot of males kind of stacked up. You'll have 6, 8, 10 males kind of in an area with one big female. And that female is going to have 50 to 100,000 eggs. And the males sometimes do this neat little dance where they kind of swim up and back, and then eventually they kind of push the female on her side and push along her belly and help get some of those eggs out. So that doesn't always occur. Sometimes the female just just releases her eggs, but that process of watching them kind of nuzzle along the belly and releasing those eggs is kind of neat. And then you'll have 8 to 10 males that will fertilize those eggs to help with genetic diversity. So kind of a neat little pattern there for how they're reproducing. Once those eggs are released and fertilized, mom and dad take off, they go back down to deeper waters, and the eggs are left to fend for themselves. So really low survival rate, but a lot of eggs that we'd see there.
There's not going to be female walleye or male walleye sitting in a stump with a mouthful of fry like we see sometimes the pictures of big catfish.
Yeah, not going to have that kind of parental care, no. Those males protecting those catfish nests are that's pretty spectacular behavior. Maybe another episode we can talk about that.
Well, I knew there was a reason I like catfish best, so.
Well, catfish is good, but it's hard to beat a walleye sandwich.
Yeah, no, I like to eat walleye for sure. So you mentioned this briefly, I think, but which of the is the male or the female going to be bigger?
Yeah, that is something I remember being surprised about. Almost always in the fish world, there are a few exceptions, almost always the bigger fish are females, right? And so males tend to be small. They tend to hit a length limit. Fish have indeterminate growth, so they keep growing as long as they're alive, but males kind of tend to slow down for the most part. Females are going to hit those higher size classes. If you're catching a really big fish, 20, 25, 30-inch fish, almost always going to be a female.
Cool. So talking about catching these fish, where are the cool fishing opportunities for these sorts of critters in Kansas, and what's important to know about those opportunities?
Yeah, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks stocks a lot of Saugeye into different reservoirs and lakes around the state. So there's lots of opportunities wherever you are in the state to go out and harvest some of them. There's a universal length limit of 15 inches on the fish, and you can keep 5 fish per day. So that's statewide. It doesn't apply to flowing waters, navigable rivers. It doesn't apply to tail waters, so below the dam, you wouldn't see that apply. But that's kind of consistent around the state. Lots of opportunities. If you go to most of our reservoirs, you're going to have an opportunity to catch Saugeye, and that'd be a great opportunity. And they continue. Kansas has a great fish culture group that is harvesting fish, getting the eggs from them, and then taking those fry and re-releasing them. In fact, they were out last night at midnight, collecting fish in El Dorado to be able to get the eggs and spawn some eggs.
That's awesome. I know they put a lot of those, or stock a lot of the Saugeye in some of our state lakes and those sorts of things too. So opportunities, even if you're not close to one of the big reservoirs.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of lakes. I mean, Kansas publishes that too. They publish a list of where they're stocking. You got to keep in mind that a lot of times if they stock a fish, you're not going to be able to go out the next day and catch it. They're smaller fish, but they can get up to harvestable size in a year, or more likely 2 to 3 years.
How long do they live?
They live about 7 to 8 years is kind of the expected lifespan, right? And so we're going to see, if you're out there catching a 28 or 30-inch fish, that's probably a 6-year-old fish. There are some fish that can live a little bit longer than that, but most of the time, 7 or 8 years. And like I said, kind of expecting that 3 to 4 year timeline for them to get to a size that most of us would want to harvest would be expected. That's not to say some of them won't get that big in a year or two, but kind of that 3 to 4 year time frame is most likely what we're looking at.
Sure. So you mentioned that the Saugeye, maybe because of hybrid vigor or who knows why, but they do better when we stock them. Are they fertile?
Yeah, so they're most of the time infertile, but they are able to reproduce in small numbers. In fact, if you have walleye and sauger in the same body of water in their native range, we would expect to see them somewhere in that 2 to 3% range would be Saugeye. There'd be some natural hybridization. So a lot of times when we see hybrids in biology, they are not fertile, so they're not able to make offspring. This is one of those instances where a vast majority of them cannot reproduce, but a small group of them will be viable. They'll have that ability to reproduce. And so something that's kind of unique to them, but it's a really small percentage. You wouldn't be able to rely on their reproduction to keep a population viable for a long period of time. But we do see a little bit of reproduction.
So in that case, I guess the stocking is really important if you've got any sort of harvest mortality or anything like that.
Yeah. So if you're out there, if you're, with Saugeye especially, especially. That's going to be kind of a put and take, something we're managing type of fishery. You can catch the numbers if you follow what percentage of fish are caught in a body of water, in a large body of water. That can be up to 20, 30, 35% of the population of fish are caught at some point during the year. And so that's a really high number if we think about it, that are caught, stressed out, maybe harvested, right? And so you can see that over time catching that large number can have implications on the population. So again, something that our Department of Wildlife and Parks here in Kansas does a great job of monitoring, making sure that they're stocking fish in a way that we can maintain this fishery over time.
That's awesome. So as we talk through different things, you mentioned several of the keys to catching Percids, but since we're talking about fishing right now, what are some main tips you can give folks so that they can be effective at catching Saugeye, walleye, or Sauger?
Yeah, get out there is the first thing.
Sure.
The more time you spend out there, the more luck you're going to have. Fishing at dusk, dawn, or overnight is generally best, and they like cooler temperatures. So getting out in the spring or fall is going to be a little bit easier to catch them. They like to be cool, and they like to not have a lot of light, and so during the day they're going to tend to be deeper. So if you're trolling crankbaits, you want something that's going to get down deep. If you're kind of going after them, make sure that they're really deep. If you're in an area where you're just targeting them, you might use something like a bottom bouncer or that Lindy rig that I talked about, where you're literally dragging just above the surface down there where the walleye are hanging out and feeding, kind of in those areas where it's a little bit darker. But they tend to be they're not as aggressive as some other fish, so trolling a little bit slower is something a lot of times that seems to be beneficial. But and then if you're not having any luck, change your bait. And so one of the things that we see a lot when we talk to people is night crawlers might work great one day, and the next day you might need leeches or minnows or something, and that might change from morning to night. And so if you're not having luck, change up what you're doing. This time of year, I know they're out catching them a lot on twisty-tailed grubs that have a night crawler on the end of it, right? So try different colors, try different speeds of retrieval. Just get out there and have fun is the big thing.
Awesome. How big do they get?
Yeah, so in Kansas they're probably getting up 6, 7, 8 pounds would be a really trophy for us. The world record walleye is 25 pounds. That was caught in Tennessee in 1965, I think, sometime around then. It's been around for a while. Sauger, the world record is 8.5 pounds. That was caught in North Dakota. And then Saugeye was about 15.5 pounds, and that was caught in Montana. So, most of the time, if you were to go catch a 5-pound or so walleye, that'd be something you'd probably think about putting on your wall, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be a big fish. 28, 30, 32 inches is when you're getting into a really big walleye.
How much do they weigh when you shove their belly full of lead?
Well, we've got weights. Yeah, that was quite the controversy. So a couple years ago, they were having a fishing tournament, and these guys kept winning, and they kept winning because they were putting lead weights in their belly. So they can weigh as much as you want if you do it that way, but we need to be able to sleep at night, so not something I'd recommend you doing.
Okay, all right. Well, that's probably a good thing to wrap up on there, I guess. So,
I would guess so.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this topic, Joe. This was a good one, and to all our listeners out there, please like, subscribe, share, give us a review, all that kind of stuff if you like the content, and we'll look forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks with a terrestrial episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.